On a Tuesday morning in June of 1978, a man named Otis Helder pulled the last cattle truck of his life out of the loading chute at his place 6 miles south of Winter in Tripp County, South Dakota. He was 51 years old. He had been running cows on that ground since the spring of 1953, when his father had handed him the herd book and the corner pasture key and had said, "It is yours to count now." He had counted it every year for 25 years. The count that morning had been 84 head of mixed Hereford and Angus cows, plus 11 bred heifers and 1 bull, 96 head loaded into 3 trucks, gooseneck cattle haulers borrowed from a neighbor, and the Helder family rig, headed for the winter sale barn for the noon auction. He stood in the gravel of his loading lot when the 3rd truck pulled out and watched it go up the long county road toward Winter. The dust rose behind it in a brown line that hung in the still June air for a long time. His wife, Bernice, was on the porch with a coffee mug in her hand, watching the same dust line. They did not say anything to each other. He had told her the night before what he was going to do. She had listened and had nodded and had not argued. She had lived on the place since 1955, and she knew when her husband had finished thinking about something and when he was still thinking. By June of 1978, he had finished thinking. He drove himself to Winter an hour later. He sat in the front row of the buyer's gallery at the sale barn, and he watched his cows go through the ring. The auctioneer was a man named Don Walters, who had been calling prices at the Winter barn since 1962, and Don was calling June of 1978 the way he had been calling spring of 1978. Strong. The Helder cattle hit the ring at 58 cents a pound on the cows and 72 cents on the bred heifers. The bull went for $900. The whole consignment came to $49,436 after the sale barn commission. Otis took the check from the office in the back of the barn at 4 in the afternoon. He folded it in half and put it in the inside pocket of his shirt. He drove home. That same afternoon, 3 miles east of Otis's place across the section line, a rancher named Burnell Schoff was driving a load of feed home from the co-op. He had heard at the elevator that the Helder consignment had run that day. He had heard the prices, 58 on the cows, 72 on the heifers. He had whistled. By the time he got home, he was already doing the math on what those prices meant for the value of his own herd. Burnell ran 130 head on his place, mostly black Angus, with some Hereford crosses he had brought in from a Nebraska sale the year before. At 58 cents on the cows, his herd, by Burnell's quick figuring, had appreciated about $8,000 in the last 6 months. He pulled into his yard with a smile on his face. He saw Otis come out of his shed across the section the next morning when he was driving past on the gravel road, and he pulled in. Otis was at the corner of his loading lot with a wrench in his hand, taking the chute apart. Burnell rolled down his pickup window and said the thing he had been thinking since he heard the prices. He said, "Otis, what are you doing taking the chute apart?" Otis straightened up and looked at him. He said, "I sold the cows yesterday." Burnell laughed once, sharply, the way a man laughs when he thinks the other man is making a joke that has not landed yet. He said, "You sold what?" Otis said, "The cows. All of them. Bull, too." Burnell sat in the cab of his pickup with his hand on the wheel for a long moment. He said, "Otis, "You are crazy," he said. "Cattle is finally paying again." He said, "This is the time to be loading up, not selling out." He said, "You have run cows on this ground since your father gave them to you." He said, "What are you going to do without cows?" Otis said one thing. He said, "I am going to put the check toward the operating note and the rest of it down on 120 acres of grass that Henrik Roth is selling at the north end of the section." He said, "I am going to run yearlings on that grass for 2 summers and see how the cattle market sits in 1980. Burnell laughed again, longer this time, broader. He said, "Otis, by 1980, cattle is going to be at 70 cents on the cow and $1 on the heifer." He said, "You are leaving $60,000 on the table by getting out now." He said, "A man does not sell his herd at peak prices and walk away from the trade." Otis put his wrench down on the top rail of the chute. He said, "Burnell, my father told me one thing about cattle, and I never forgot it. He said, you only get to count the herd once a year. Count it on the day you would sell it." He said, "I counted it yesterday. The count came out at $49,436 and 120 acres of grass." He said, "That is what the herd was worth to me. Anything more would have been gambling." Burnell rolled up his window after a minute. He drove home, shaking his head. That afternoon at the co-op, he told 3 men what Otis had done, and all 3 men shook their heads. By the end of the week, Otis Helder had become the man in Tripp County who had sold his cattle at the top of the market for no good reason any of his neighbors could see. There was a kind of quiet talk about it at the co-op for a month. Otis went about the work of buying the Roth ground and putting yearlings on the new pasture. He did not respond to the talk because there was no responding to it. He had done what he had done. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments about the time you made a decision your neighbors thought was crazy, and the years that followed proved you right. Those are the stories I want to hear. The 1979 cattle market opened strong, the way Burnell had said it would. Cow prices held at 55 to 58 cents through the spring. Bred heifers went up. By April, Burnell had decided to expand. He drove down to a sale barn in O'Neill, Nebraska, and he bid on a consignment of 45 bred heifers, mostly black baldies, with calving dates running March and April of 1980. The heifers brought $725 a head, the strongest bred heifer prices Burnell had ever paid for stock. He paid them anyway. The total bill, with hauling, came to $33,480. He financed the entire amount on a 5-year cattle note from the bank in winter at 14%. His annual payment on the heifer note was about $8,500, due every November. He drove home from O'Neill with the heifers in 3 trailers and a feeling in his chest that he was finally doing what a man was supposed to do, building a herd. He told Otis about the purchase the next time he saw him at the elevator. He said, "I am at 175 head now, Otis." He said, "You should have kept yours." He said, "The calf crop next spring is going to be the best one I have ever weaned." Otis nodded. He said, "That is good, Burnell. I hope it is." He paid for his bag of mineral and walked out to his pickup. That summer, Otis ran 68 yearling steers on the Roth ground. He had bought them in May at 52 cents a pound, lighter cattle, 6-weight calves. He was going to run them through the summer and shipped them off the grass in late September. He had no breeding stock on the place. The corner pasture, where the cow herd had grazed for 25 years, was rented out to a neighbor for the season at $3,000. Otis was running a different operation than he had been running his whole life. And it was simpler, and he was paying attention to it differently. He had time in the evenings now. He read the cattle market reports. He read the feed grain reports. He read the Federal Reserve weekly bulletins on interest rates and the federal funds rate. He had not done that kind of reading before. The herd had taken his evenings. The reading was telling him something. Through the summer of 1979, the federal funds rate climbed past 10% for the first time in a decade. By August, it was at 11. By October, with Paul Volcker now at the helm of the Fed, the rate spiked to 15% and was still climbing. Otis read this in the bulletins at his kitchen table at night, with the radio off and Bernice already in bed, and he understood what it meant for cattle. High interest rates killed the carrying cost of livestock. A rancher running a herd on borrowed money has to make the herd pay for the interest before it can pay for anything else. At 15%, the herd cannot pay. The math will not let it. The price of cattle is going to fall because the cost of holding cattle is going to rise, and the men who borrowed at 14% in April of 1979 to buy bred heifers at $725 are going to find out together what that math means. He did not go tell Burnell what he was reading. There was no point. Burnell had signed the heifer note. The note was the note. And Otis had been the man who sold the cows in June of 1978. He had no credibility in Tripp County to tell Burnell anything about cattle in October of 1979. He let it sit. The 1979 calf shipping in late September went well for Otis. His 68 steers came off the grass at $8.20 a head, sold at 56 cents on the open market. Gross of $38,112 on cattle he had paid roughly $28,000 for in May. Net of about $10,000 on a summer's grass running, plus the rent on the corner pasture, plus no operating note to service, because the 1978 herd sale had cleared it. That winter, the winter of 1979 to 1980, Otis sat in his shop in the cold on the days when the wind was not too hard, and he repaired equipment and built a new headgate for the corral and cleaned the old headgate, and he thought. He had time to think now. The cattle market had softened slightly in November. Cow prices were down to 51 cents. Bred heifers were down too. Burnell's spring 1979 heifers, if he tried to sell them now, would not bring what he had paid for them. By December, the slide was real. The federal funds rate was at 17%. Feed costs were up. Banks were starting to call notes on cattle operations that had over-leveraged in 1978 and 1979. Burnell did not call his note. The bank in winter did not call it either. Yet. But the November 1979 payment of $8,500 came due, and Burnell paid it from his operating account. And the operating account was already thinner than it should have been because cattle were softer than he had budgeted for. The almost quit moment for Otis came at the kitchen table on a Saturday night in February of 1980. He had been alone in the house for an hour because Bernice had driven into winter for a church supper. The radio was on the kitchen counter playing low. The market reports had come in that afternoon, and feeder cattle were down further. Otis had been reading the bulletins and had been thinking, that whole afternoon that maybe he had read it all wrong. Maybe Burnell had been right after all, and the cattle market was going to recover by spring. Maybe the Fed funds rate was going to come back down, and the herds were going to hold their value, and the men who had stayed in cattle were going to look smart, and the man who had sold out at 60 was going to look like a coward who could not stay in the trade. He had sat at the table for 40 minutes thinking that. He had thought about driving down to the winter barn the next Tuesday and buying a few young cows, just to start a herd, 10 or 15 head, to put back on the corner pasture and start over. He had felt the pull of it. The pull was not the pull of greed. The pull was the pull of being the man who had run cows on his father's ground for 25 years and was now the man who did not. He had sat with that for a long time. Then he had gotten up and walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at the corner pasture. The pasture was dark and empty in the February night. He had said out loud to no one the sentence his father had said to him in 1956 when his father had been about to retire. His father had said, "You only get to count the herd once a year. Count it on the day you would sell it." He had counted his herd in June of 1978. The count had come out right. There was no recounting allowed. A man who recounted his herd every season was a man who would never sell it for what it was worth, because the count would always be moving, and a moving count is not a count. He had felt right about it. He had not felt good about it. Those are different things, and Otis Helder knew the difference. He had not gone to the winter barn that Tuesday. He had stayed home and worked on the pasture fences. The cattle crash arrived in earnest in the spring and summer of 1980. The federal funds rate hit 20% in March. Feeder cattle prices fell from 52 cents in November to 43 cents by April to 38 cents by June. Bred heifers, the ones Burnell had paid $725 a head for the year before, were now bringing under $500 at the winter barn. Don Walters, the auctioneer, was calling the prices the same way he had always called them, but his voice carried something different now. He had called the 1978 peak. He was calling the 1980 trough. He had been at this counter long enough to know the difference. He did not say it out loud. He just called the numbers. Burnell's spring 1980 calving did not go the way he had hoped. Of the 45 bred heifers from the Nebraska sale, 6 lost their calves to a wet cold snap in March, and another 3 came down with mastitis after calving and lost milk production. He weaned 36 live calves off the heifer purchase. Combined with the rest of the herd, he weaned about 140 calves total. He shipped them in October at 36 cents a pound, about half of what the same calves would have brought in 1978. His gross on the calf crop was around $42,000. His operating expenses for the year had been around $38,000. His November cattle note payment was $8,500. His operating note was already extended. He went into the bank in winter, the second week of November of 1980. The loan officer was a man named Ralph Kinsler. Ralph had known Burnell since they were boys at the same country school. Ralph said the things a loan officer says in November of 1980 when his customer is sitting across from him with a calf check that does not cover the operating note plus the cattle note payment. Ralph said, "We are going to have to restructure this, Burnell." He said, "A lot of fellows are coming in here this fall." He said, "I can give you another 6 months on the cattle note, but the operating loan is going to need to come down by the end of the year." He said, We have got to get that operating loan back inside its cap." Burnell drove home from winter that day with his hands tight on the wheel. He sat in his pickup in his own yard for 15 minutes before he went into the house. He did not tell Eunice, that was his wife, what Ralph had said. 3 weeks later, in early December of 1980, Burnell drove past Otis's place on the way to a sale he was not going to bid at, just to watch what was running. Otis was in his yard splitting wood for the wood stove. Burnell pulled into the drive. Otis set them all down and walked over to the truck. Burnell rolled the window down. He did not have a smile on his face like he had in June of 1978. He said, "Otis, I want to tell you something." He said, "I came over here in the summer of 1978, and I told you that you were crazy." He said, "I have been thinking about that conversation for 2 years." He said, "I was not paying attention to the right things in 1978. He said, "You were?" He said, "I was paying attention to what cattle had been doing for the last 6 months." He said, "You were paying attention to what cattle had been doing for the last 25 years and what your father had told you in 1956. He said, "Those are 2 different things." He said, "I am telling you that you were not crazy. I was not paying attention." Otis stood in the gravel of his drive with his hands in the pockets of his canvas coat. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Burnell, you were not wrong to expand in 1979. The signs were good. The numbers worked at the prices that were true that spring. Nobody knew the Fed was going to take rates to 20%. Nobody knew that until it happened." He said, "I read the bulletins because I had time to read the bulletins, because I had sold the herd and was running yearlings. If I had still been running the cow herd, I would not have been reading the bulletins either. I would have been doing the work." He said, "That is the trouble with cattle. The work eats the reading time, and when you cannot read, you cannot see what is coming. My father knew that. He told me once. I never forgot it." Burnell nodded slowly. He said, "He told you to count the herd once a year on the day you would sell it." Otis said, "Yes, that is what he said." Burnell said, "I have not counted my herd that way in any of the years I have run them." Otis said, "That is the difference between us, Burnell. Not crazy or smart, just the count." Burnell drove home a few minutes later. He sold 30 head of cows that next March at the winter barn at 46 cents. He used the check to pay down the operating loan. He kept the rest of the herd. He paid the cattle note for 2 more years on a restructure and finally cleared it in 1985. He never did make back what he had paid for the spring 1979 heifers. The math did not let him. Nobody who had bought heifers at $725 in spring of 1979 ever made it back. The market did not return to those prices in the 1980s. The few times it tried, it failed. Otis ran yearlings on the Roth ground for 14 straight summers. He never went back into the cow business. The corner pasture where the herd had grazed for 25 years stayed leased to neighbors at $3,000 a year, then $4,000 by the late 1980s, then $6,000 by 1995. The Roth ground he had bought in 1978 with a herd sale check appreciated to about $800 an acre by 1985 and to about $1,300 by 1995. The herd sale check had been $49,436 in 1978 money. The land it had bought was worth, by 1995, about $156,000, and was generating $5,000 a year in clean rent during the years he was not running yearlings on it. The herd would not have done that. The herd would have eaten its own value through the 1980s the way Burnell's herd had. The math, written out across 17 years, looked like this. The 1978 sale check had been $49,436. Net of operating note payoff, Otis had put about $42,000 down on the Roth ground at $350 an acre. By 1995, that ground was worth about $1,300 an acre, a value of $156,000. The yearling business through 14 summers had cleared an average of about $9,400 a year. So call it $131,000 in clean cash flow across that period after expenses. Plus, the corner pasture rent compounding from $3,000 to $6,000 a year, totaling around $63,000 over 17 years. Total, roughly $350,000 of value coming out of a 1978 decision that had cost him a herd he had counted at $49,436. By contrast, Burnell, who had stayed in cattle and expanded in 1979, had paid $33,480 for the bred heifers, had serviced the note across 7 restructured years at roughly $59,500 in interest and principal combined, had sold 60 acres in 1984 to clear it, and had a herd in 1995 that was smaller than the one he had owned in 1978. The accounts were simply not on the same page. 2 men, the same prairie, 2 different counts. In the fall of 1995, Otis was 68. He had stopped running yearlings 2 years earlier. The Roth ground was rented out for grass to a neighbor's son. His own son, Calvin, had taken over the home place. Calvin was 41 and had never run a cow herd because there had not been a cow herd to inherit. Because Otis had sold them in 1978 and had bought ground with the money. Calvin had a different operation than his father had had. He ran some yearlings, custom grazed for an out-of-state owner, and farmed 200 acres of small grains on a dryland rotation. The Roth ground was the cornerstone of the operation. It was Calvin's now in everything but the deed. The deed would come on a date Calvin was not yet thinking about. Burnell Schoff was 63 in 1995 and still ranching. He had 380 acres now, down from the 440 he had been running in 1978, having sold 60 acres in 1984 to clear the cattle note restructure. He was running about 75 cows. The herd was smaller than it had been at his peak in 1979. He counted it twice a year now, once in May at branding and once in October at shipping. He had told his son once around 1990 what Otis had told him about the once-a-year count, and his son had asked where that had come from. Burnell had said, "That came from a man named Otis Helder, who is the smartest cattleman I ever knew, and who got out of the business in June of 1978 because he could count." The 2 men still see each other at the winter barn occasionally. They still talk. Burnell does not ask Otis for advice, and Otis does not give it. They talk about the weather and about who is selling and about the price of feed. The conversation about June of 1978 does not come up directly anymore. It does not need to. They both know what was said. They both know who was right and why. The why is the part that matters. Otis was not right because he was lucky. He was right because he had counted the herd the way his father had told him to count it. The salesman, the loan officer, the auctioneer, the magazine. Those four voices were telling Burnell in 1979 that the herd was worth more than Otis had counted it at in 1978. They were all wrong. Otis had been right because he had used his own count and because his count had a rule. And the rule was a sentence his father had said once and never said again. You only get to count the herd once a year. Count it on the day you would sell it. The sentence kept Otis honest. Without the sentence, he might have stayed in cattle and lost what Burnell lost. Maybe more. Always put the money in the thing that stays. The ground stayed. The herd did not. Subscribe to the honest farmer. Hit the bell. The next story is about a man in Iowa who built a grain bin in 1973 with $1,800 in sheet steel and bolts, and his neighbor who put up the same size bin in 1980 for $19,000 on a note. And what happened to both bins in the 1993 flood? It is the same story, told with different equipment. It is always the same story.